Good evening. The year 2025 marks the collapse of the old world order. The world stands at a crossroads as the systems and alliances that once held nations together begin to unravel. For decades, globalization and free trade, anchored by the US dollar, promised prosperity and peace. Borders seemed to fade as goods, capital and ideas flowed freely across continents, creating a sense of shared destiny. But that era is over. Economic nationalism now dominates, as countries retreat behind their borders and prioritize their own interests above all else. Governments are intervening to protect domestic industries and assert national interests. Policies once considered extreme are now mainstream as leaders promise to shield their citizens from global shocks. The US, once the champion of open markets, now leads the charge in building economic walls. Tariffs, quotas and new regulations are reshaping the rules of international commerce. This is more than policy. It's a new worldview. Domestic resilience over global efficiency. Communities are encouraged to buy local and supply chains are being rebuilt to withstand global disruptions. Political discontent fueled this shift as many Americans felt betrayed by globalization's uneven rewards. The middle class, once the backbone of prosperity, now faces uncertainty and rising costs. Leaders blamed foreign nations, especially China, and promised to bring jobs home. National pride and economic security have become rallying cries in a divided nation. Protectionism became the new US strategy. Trade barriers are rising, and the global marketplace is fragmenting into competing blocs. The result, a world of confrontation, not cooperation. Diplomatic tensions are rising, and old alliances are being tested as nations jostle for advantage. Tariffs and sanctions are now tools of foreign policy, redrawing supply chains along geopolitical lines. Companies scramble to adapt, seeking new partners and safer routes. Nations must pick sides, and global relationships are more unpredictable than ever. Trust is scarce, and every negotiation is fraught with suspicion. The unwinding of globalization is reshaping the world, likely for good. The international order that once seemed permanent is now in flux. We've entered a fragmented, dangerous era, one where economic rivalry defines the international landscape and the future remains uncertain for all. A tariff is a tax placed on goods that are brought into a country from abroad. It's one of the oldest tools governments use to regulate trade and manage their economies. By adding a fee to imported products, tariffs make these goods more expensive for buyers, often causing shoppers to think twice before purchasing foreign-made items. For example, a 10% tariff on a $30,000 German car means the buyer pays an extra $3,000, raising the total cost to $33,000. This price hike can make imported cars less attractive compared to domestic options. Tariffs are mainly used to protect domestic industries by making foreign products less competitive. This can help local businesses grow, preserve jobs, and encourage consumers to buy homegrown goods. But tariffs aren't just about economics. They can also serve as powerful tools of foreign policy, pressuring other countries to change their behavior or negotiate better trade deals. However, tariffs come with risks. They can lead to higher costs for businesses that rely on imported materials, rising prices for everyday consumers, and even contribute to inflation across the economy. Other countries often retaliate by imposing their own tariffs on US exports, making it harder for American companies to sell their products overseas. This tit-for-tat escalation can spiral into trade wars, disrupting global commerce, slowing economic growth, and creating uncertainty for businesses and workers worldwide. Ultimately, tariffs are a blunt instrument, easy for governments to impose, but with complex, far-reaching consequences that can be difficult to predict or control. While they can protect certain jobs and industries, tariffs often come at the cost of higher prices for everyone, and can strain relationships between countries. In today's interconnected world, tariffs are as much about political power and influence as they are about simple economics. The line between trade policy and foreign policy has blurred, making every tariff decision a potential global event. The result is a more volatile, unpredictable global economy, one where the impact of tariffs can be felt by everyone, from factory workers to families at the checkout line. In late 2025, the Trump administration launched sweeping tariffs, shaking the global economy. A 145% tariff on all Chinese goods signaled the end of engagement and the start of economic confrontation. Major emerging economies like India and Brazil faced 50% tariffs. Even Switzerland was hit. Allies weren't spared. Europe, Japan, and South Korea saw 15% tariffs, a major blow to export-driven economies. Specific industries like European trucks and pharmaceuticals faced even harsher rates. The unpredictability of these policies created chaos in boardrooms worldwide. This marked a break from decades of US-led trade policy. Washington, once the rulemaker, became the disruptor. The gamble: use US economic power to force global change. But the backlash would challenge American dominance and push the world into uncharted territory. Tariffs became leverage, not just protection. The US demanded massive investments from allies like Japan, South Korea, and the EU to reduce tariffs. Japan agreed to $550 billion in US investments, sparking outrage at home. The EU committed $600 billion, but resentment grew across the Atlantic. South Korea balked at a $350 billion demand, leading to a diplomatic standoff. These ultimatums turned alliances into transactional relationships. Decades of trust and shared values eroded, replaced by suspicion and frustration. Allies questioned the cost of partnership with the US. The result: a push for strategic autonomy in Europe and Asia. America's heavy-handed approach damaged its most important alliances. The world's trust in US leadership was shaken. Allies began to rethink their economic dependence on America. The US tariff shock united the BRICS nations against American economic power. They accelerated efforts to create a financial system independent of the dollar. BRICS countries began trading in their own currencies: yuan, rubles, rupees, and dirhams. This chipped away at the dollar's dominance and reduced vulnerability to US sanctions. Alternative payment systems like China's CIPS gained traction, bypassing SWIFT. Russia, cut off from SWIFT, became a major CIPS user. BRICS central banks diversified reserves, buying gold instead of dollars. Gold became a safe haven, immune to US policy. These moves signaled a deep loss of faith in the dollar as the world's anchor. The global financial system began to fragment. The era of dollar supremacy was under threat. A new multipolar financial order was taking shape. The trade war's impact was immediate and personal. The auto industry suffered as tariffs drove up costs for European and Japanese cars. Profits fell, investments stalled, and stock prices dropped. US farmers were hit hard when China stopped buying American soybeans, devastating the Midwest. Supply chains unraveled, and prices for everyday goods, from cabinets to cars, rose sharply. Inflation squeezed household budgets, forcing tough choices for families. The promise of job protection came with a higher cost of living. In tech, the US demanded more domestic chip production, threatening higher prices for electronics. The push for national resilience risked widespread inflation and tech disruption. Consumers worldwide felt the pinch. The global economy became more unpredictable. The trade war's costs were borne by workers, businesses, and families everywhere. The US tariff strategy backfired, uniting adversaries and alienating allies. China, Russia, and India set aside rivalries to counter US pressure, deepening cooperation on trade and resources. They coordinated efforts to bypass the dollar and secure critical supply chains. Meanwhile, allies like Japan and the EU felt betrayed by America's transactional demands. Decades of trust eroded as alliances became strained. Europe accelerated its push for strategic autonomy, doubting US reliability. America's global influence weakened as its alliance network frayed. The US traded long-term strength for short-term gains. The world became more divided, with new coalitions forming against US dominance. The unintended consequence: America found itself more isolated than ever. The year 2025 marked a turning point, signaling that the era of unchallenged US economic dominance is truly over. The world watched as the foundations of global finance began to shift, and the once unquestioned supremacy of the dollar faced new and powerful challenges. Tariffs, sanctions, and the weaponization of the dollar accelerated the search for alternatives. Countries wary of overdependence on a single currency began to diversify their trade and reserves. The dollar's role as the world's sole reserve currency is steadily fading, as nations seek greater autonomy and resilience in their financial systems. BRICS nations now trade in their own currencies, develop new payment systems, and stockpile gold to reduce reliance on the dollar. These moves are reshaping the global economic landscape. The world is moving toward a multipolar currency system, where influence is shared among several major economies, rather than dominated by one. The dollar remains important, but now shares the stage with the yuan, euro, and other rising currencies. Financial power is more widely distributed than ever before. For the US, this shift means losing the unique privilege of printing the world's money and running endless deficits without consequence. The economic landscape is becoming more competitive. Global power is now distributed among several major players, each with their own interests and strategies for growth. No single nation can dictate terms anymore. Negotiation, cooperation, and compromise are now essential for progress. The transition to this new order is fraught with uncertainty and risk, as markets and governments adapt to unfamiliar realities. Yet, a multipolar world could ultimately be more balanced, inclusive, and representative of diverse interests and cultures. The challenge ahead is to manage this historic shift peacefully, and to build a new foundation for global order that benefits all. The age of one superpower is over. The era of many powers working together and sometimes in competition has truly begun.